Chapter 10, Lesson 2, History of the Region of the Andes and Mid-Latitude Countries. Our objectives for today's lesson are to explain the rise and fall of the Incan Empire, to describe how countries of the region gained their independence, and to discuss economic challenges and political instability in the region. As we go through our reading and go through our PowerPoint presentation today, you've got your guiding reading activity to take care of that looks like this. Essential question: why do civilizations rise and fall? As we're studying the massive Incan Empire that was one of the most dominant in this entire region until the Spanish conquest and colonization. In the very first section, as we talk about the early history and conquest, you're going to fill in the timeline and sequence the different major events that happen. So you're going to fill in the blanks for these approximations for the different years and the events that happened. There are 5 of those that you're looking for in your reading. After that, we're reading about the independent states. So when the different countries in this region changed out of the time of colonialization and finally found their independence. Here you're going to use your textbook to fill in the blanks for number 1, number 2, and number 3. In the last portion, as we look at the history in the modern era, we're going to see what has taken place and happened since these countries have gained their independence. What type of challenges, political instability, and change has taken place. And this would be the largest section in terms of what you're doing in your assignment. You're going to answer the questions about the Andean countries and the mid-latitude states during the 1800s and 1900s. Here you're answering questions 1 through 10. Let's get started. The rise and fall of the Inca Empire. I'm on page 306. You're also welcome to follow along in your online textbook. You can read through your online textbook here with some of the features, additional videos and pictures, or you can click the listen button up at the top and follow along as well. Native Americans and European colonizations made major contributions to the history of the region of South America. The actions and achievements of both groups continue to influence life today. Almost all the countries in the region have been independent for nearly 2 centuries. Still, their history continues to influence their culture. Rise and fall of the Incan Empire. Before the rise of the Incan in the 1100s, the Andean region was home of small Native American societies such as the Moche, the Mapuche, and the Aymara. These societies were based primarily on agriculture. The Moche settled on the arid coastline of northern Peru. Archaeological finds show that they were talented at engineering and irrigation. They used a complex irrigation system to grow corn, beans, and other crops. The Inca developed a highly sophisticated civilization. They first settled in Cuzco Valley in what is now Peru. It was not until the 5th Emperor Capac Yapuanqui that they began to expand outside the valley in the 1400s under the rule of Pachacuti, Inca's Yanquil. The Inca made extensive conquests. By the early 1500s, the Inca ruled a region stretching from northern Ecuador through Peru and then southward into Chile. Historians estimate that the area was home to 12 million people. This population included dozens of separate cultural groups who spoke many different languages. The Inca state was called Tawantinasio, that means the land of the 4 quarters. The imperial capital was located where the 4 quarters or provinces of the Incan Empire met, at Cuzco. Incan society was highly structured. At the top of the hierarchy was the emperor, the high priest, and the commander of the army. Then the nobility served the emperor as administrators. At the bottom of the societal pyramid were farmers and laborers. So you can see here on this map the massive stretch from what was the original area of Cuzco Valley here in Peru to the conquest that took place over years, to where now you have this entire region having almost 12 million people at the height of the Incan Empire. Now, it's not because there was a high population during this time in history, it's because it covered so much massive land area that's why there's so many people. The Incan Empire was so large that they just kept consuming the different areas in their conquest to grow to be such a massive, massive empire. It was kind of the old notion of if you can't beat them, join them, in terms of having how many people join in on what would be the Incan Empire. It mentioned that because of this, there's many different languages and many different cultural groups within this group, but all adhering to and following by what would be the Incan hierarchy and structure. Here's what that hierarchy looks like, in which you'd have the high priest, the emperor, the army commander as the top of the line, those who are making decisions and governing over other people. Then you have the nobility, and below that you have got your common folk, your peasant farmer or laborer. Incan technology and engineering were highly advanced. The Inca built extensive irrigation systems, roads, tunnels, and bridges that linked regions of the empire to Cusco. Today, you can still see the remains of Incan cities and fortresses. Some of the most impressive ruins are Machu Picchu, located about 50 miles northwest of Cusco. This map shows the extensive road system that was built. Now remember, this is in the Andes Mountains here, so you can see why these roads have this kind of parallel or lateral type of movement, because the mountains are set up to run in those cordilleras, so they're in these parallel ranges, and in the valley areas is where you could have that type of transportation. Also along the coast or in between the other set of mountains, they built this extensive road system so that there's a lot of travel that can happen in this entire area. The ruins that they're speaking of, here's a picture of Machu Picchu, in which this massive city and civilization is built in the midst of the mountains. So you can kind of see what the landscape looks like and what people would have to do in order to travel in these areas, up and down mountains or through them. It's pretty impressive that the Inca were able to build such a connected system, because at times before this, there were isolated groups of people because it was so difficult to travel in this region. The Inca had no written language. Instead, they created a counting system called quipu for record keeping. A quipu was a series of knotted cords of various colors and lengths. Messengers carrying quipu could travel as far as 150 miles per day on the roads. The Inca became extremely wealthy because of their vast natural resources of gold and silver. You can see here Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Bolivia. This entire region is known to have that Incan influence until Spain comes into the picture. Unfortunately for the Inca, however, their advanced culture would not turn back the invasion that led to the empire's downfall. The Spanish conquest in Mexico encouraged them to move into South America. In 1532, a Spanish adventurer named Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru with a small band of soldiers. Pizarro had heard tales of the fabulously rich in the Pacific coast of South America. He also learned that the Incan Empire had been badly weakened by a civil war from which the new emperor, Atahualpa, had emerged victorious. When the Spanish confronted Atahualpa, the Inca army, unprepared to face Spanish artillery, was nearly destroyed. Within a few years, the Spanish controlled the entire empire. The Spanish also seized control of the region's precious metals. The road system that the Inca developed became an important transportation route for Spanish goods. The Inca and their ancestors are the Native Americans who lived in the Andes region today. The Spanish has branched out from Peru to create colonies in Argentina, Chile, and other parts of South America. The Spanish military victories were called conquistadors, from the Spanish word for conqueror. The Spanish colonies became sources of wealth of Spain. Some Spanish settlers prospered from gold and silver mining. Spanish rule of the Andean and mid-latitude areas in the region continued for nearly 300 years. After the Inca lost their empire to the Spanish, they and other Native Americans of the region endured great hardship. Their numbers declined drastically as a result of smallpox, a highly infectious disease introduced by Europeans. The introduction of the epidemic diseases also affected numerous Native American groups in North America. Independent countries. How did each of these countries in the region gain their independence? That's what we're focusing on as we answer this question. This should also help you with your guiding me activity in terms of filling in the blanks. By the early 1800s, most of South America had been under Spanish control for nearly 300 years. History was about to change once again. The reasons for this shift were local as well as international. Overthrow of Spanish rule. In the early 1800s, revolution and liberation movements were occurring around the world. The United States threw off British rule and the French replaced the monarchy with a republic. Struggles for independence also occurred in Mexico and in the Caribbean. People in South America were encouraged by these events. It was exactly the right time for two South American revolutionary leaders to lead the fight against Spanish rule. These two leaders were Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. The two leaders were able to rally support for independence. San Martín pioneered many elements of guerrilla warfare, which is the use of troops who know the local landscape so well that they are difficult for traditional armies to find. By the mid-1800s, many South American countries had gained their independence. Chile, 1821, Peru in 1821, Bolivia in 1825, Paraguay in 1811, Uruguay in 1825, Argentina in 1810. However, where does that power and governance go when you have a new country that is completely independent? You've got to kind of set up a new system of government if the ruling government is overthrown. In this case, the Spanish are overthrown and these countries gain their independence. After the Spanish left, South America and several different countries formed. Their borders mostly followed the division set in place by the Spanish colonizers, but despite gaining independence, political and economic hardship continued on the continent. In contrast to the United States, there was no strong momentum for unity in South America. In fact, the rulers of many of the nearly new independent states were wealthy aristocrats, powerful landowners, or military dictators. Their mindset was more European than South American. In addition, communication between countries was difficult because of the mountainous terrain. So you have these two factors that influence why these countries don't band together. In the United States, they believed that they were stronger together. No one state could stand up to the entire British Empire, so they fought together in the Revolutionary War. Well, a lot of these countries in South America fought together as well, but there was a distinct difference between them not joining together afterwards or staying together to have this unification. They kind of are separated by geography and therefore separate themselves to say, well, we can do this on our own. The new countries lacked a tradition of self-government. The British colonies in North America had elected representatives in their colony legislature. The new states of South America did not have a structure in place for a government to function. The newly independent countries drafted constitutions. The enormously uneven distribution of wealth between rich and poor, however, resulted in social and economic instability. Several countries engaged in bloody conflicts over boundary disputes and mineral rights. These conflicts led to much loss of life and weakened economies. For example, General Augusto Pinochet led Chile, and now this is in the modern times, after we've moved from this kind of time of political instability into modern history. You can see what's happening still in each country. General Augusto Pinochet led Chile from 1974 to 1990. Pinochet took part of a military coup that overthrew the government of Salvador Allende, who was moving Chile towards socialism. Pinochet's economic policies were popular, but his administration was accused of many serious abuses, including torture and murder. As we read about history in the modern era, we're going to hear these names. So I wanted to introduce you to what has been this kind of political instability for a long time and what these countries have gone through in their histories. In Peru, Alberto Fujimori served as president from 1990 to 2000. He too was credited with improving the economy, but was accused of violations of civil rights and unfair voting practices. In Paraguay, General Alfredo Stroessner led Paraguay from 1954 to 1989. Many who opposed him were imprisoned and or left the country. History of the region in the modern era. Here's where you're answering those 10 questions, numbers 1 through 10. The Andean and mid-latitude countries continued to face challenges during the 1800s and 1900s. With military backing, dictators seized power and they ignored democratic constitutions. Economies were still dependent on outside powers. Economic challenges. The countries of the region faced economic challenges. Among the challenges were developing and controlling resources, building roads and railroads, and establishing trade links. Because independence, the countries of the region depended economically on Spain and Brazil. After independence, the economies of the region remained tied to countries outside South America. Rapidly industrializing countries in Europe exploited the region for its raw materials. Wealthy landowners, cattle grazers, and mining operators refused to surrender their ties to European investors. Beginning in the early 1900s, large U.S. and European multinational firm companies, these are companies that do business in several countries, started mining and smelting operations in the region. So if the people that are living in these countries don't have the resources to start their own company, they're welcoming in these other countries that are going to provide them jobs. These multinational groups, which are kind of established companies that are come in and set up their operation and then exploit the local resources and exploit the local people to make money and take that money back to their own country. As the economies expanded, profits grew for wealthy landowners and multinational companies, but many workers and farmers and their families remained mired in poverty. So those those economic challenges can come from these two main ideas: developing and controlling resources. Once the established government leaves, such as the Spanish, you've got to set up your own system. Well, they didn't really have a prominent education, so they don't have a prominent way in which to build these businesses. And now, because of the different countries having their own independence, you don't also have a way in which there's trade links or agreements between different countries to get those activities to go, those economic trade activities or agreements. So European countries then see this as an opportunity and they exploit this. They send their companies and their people to harvest raw materials from the region. The wealthy landowners that are in this area, the cattle grazers, mining operations, They maintain business relationship with the European investors, so there's connections to Europe because Europe is more established at this point. And U.S. and European multinational firms start mining and smelting operations in the region. So they're not their countries' own operations. They're countries from outside of South America that are benefiting from what South America has to offer. What's the result of this? Well, the wealthy landowners and the multinational companies, they grow more wealthy, and the people that are working these basic level positions for these big companies, they make enough money to provide for themselves, but not really to get out of poverty at all. Political instability. Economic woes led to calls for reform. Political leaders promised changes for the better. In 1946, Argentinians elected General Juan Perón as the nation's president. Perón and his wife Eva were popular with the people. The new government enacted economic reforms to benefit the working people. However, the Perón government limited free speech, censored the press, and added to the country's debt. After Perón was overthrown in 1955, the military government ruled Argentina. The new government moved to put an end to unrest. The rulers and imprisoned thousands of people without trial. Some were tortured or killed. Others simply disappeared. Argentina was also troubled by conflict over the Falkland Islands. Argentina and Great Britain both claimed the Falkland Islands, and after a brief war in 1982, Argentina was defeated and the Falkland remains a British overseas territory. Significant changes were also taking place in the country of Chile. In the presidential election of 1970, Chileans elected a socialist candidate named Salvador Allende. Allende took action to redistribute wealth and land. The government took over Chile's copper industry and banking system. Allende's economic reforms were popular with workers but angered the upper class. In 1973, Chilean military officers staged a coup, which is an illegal seizure of power, and they killed the president, Allende. A military dictatorship headed by General Augusto Pinochet ruled Chile for the next 16 years. Movements for change. In recent years, democracies have replaced dictatorships, yet the countries in the region are still struggling to end corruption in government, shrink the gap between rich and poor, and provide jobs and protect human rights. Voters also have elected new leaders. In 2005, Bolivia has elected Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous president. Morales introduced a new constitution and land reforms, brought industries under government ownership, and moved to limit U.S. corporate involvement in the country's politics. In 2006, Chileans elected the country's first female president, Michelle Bachelet. A year later, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner became Argentina's first elected female president. Both female leaders started efforts to improve human rights and equal opportunity. So you have this long history since the time of independence in the 1800s of unrest, political turmoil, change in government, and couple that with the economic issues throughout this entire time. It's not until in most recent years that you see these dictatorships turning into democracies and then full elections being taken place so that people have a vote in who they want to represent them. You see even major changes happening in the form of women becoming president in prominent roles in these countries. Maybe that'll happen in our country in the near future. That should help you with answering the questions in numbers 1 through 10. Go back and reread that section, focus specifically on what those questions are asking you to complete that activity. God's blessings.